Hello, welcome to Us. I'm Julia George. Coming up later, London is the greatest city on earth. No, it's not an invitation to the circus. It's the oft-used mantra of the mayor. But is it true? And for whom exactly? Joining us for the next 20 minutes or so, Matthew Offord. Matthew is the Conservative MP for Hendon. And we're also joined by Tessa Jowell, Labour MP for Dulwich and West Norwood. Thank you both for joining us. Tessa Jowell, I'd like to start with a point of clarification. I'm sure all Londoners would like to know for sure. Are you or aren't you standing for London Mayor?
I'm not declaring yet because the most important thing is to win as many seats as we can in the general election. So my position is that I'm supporting candidates all over London in our marginal seats. And I'm also preparing a plan so that when the time comes, I can set out what would be my offer to London if I were to become Labour's candidate.
It's a bit like a couple announcing their intention to announce that they're getting engaged. Will people be able to put their name against your name tick your name in the ballot paper? You know, if they pay their money to have their say for Labour's candidate.
That depends on being selected as the Labour candidate.
But you will put your name forward to be the Labour candidate.
It is certainly my intention at the right time to announce my candidacy. But at the moment, we're focused on the general election.
Matthew, are you any clearer than I am? Do you think Tessa Jowell is going to stand for the Labour candidacy or not? What are you hearing?
I think that Tessa is going to stand as well.
We think it's a yes.
It's admirable. She's working in marginal seats.
See, David Lammy is up and running, and Diane Abbott's up and running.
Announcing tomorrow.
Are you up and running?
Listen, can I just say, I don't want to contribute to a rather ridiculous conversation. You know, I keep on being asked. I'm working hard, trying to answer some of the big questions that London faces. The shortage of homes.
Well, look,
the incapacity of... Just come out, Tessa, and tell the people.
No, I will do it at the time. I'm a team player in my party, and I think that we have to put the general election and support for our marginal candidates before anything else. So that's what I plan to do, while at the same time making a constructive contribution to answering some of the big challenges that London faces.
David Lammy, MP for Tottenham, is running. He's called strongly for greater powers to be devolved to the capital. What further devolved powers would you call for if you were London Mayor?
Well, I think that Tony Travis's commission on the financial devolution is a very good starting point, and devolution is, if you like, the revolution that's sweeping through politics. Scotland, no doubt Wales, English regions, Scotland, England, and very particularly London mustn't be left behind. But all this with the integrity of two things. First of all, London isn't a city-state cut loose from the rest of the UK, and we are a United Kingdom, and Scotland voted to remain part of the United Kingdom 2 months ago. So yes, more devolution.
I do want to bring Matthew, and we're left him out very quickly.
That wants to be Mayor of London.
But yes, I think many people will agree. What about Paxman as the Tory candidate? Apparently he says he flew to Paris to avoid the conversation with David Cameron. He's just the high-profile man you need, isn't he?
Well, I certainly would like to see Paxman do so, but I understand he's already ruled himself out. I think whoever is the Mayor of London needs to be a figure, someone who can not only take on the challenges of the capital, but also has a strong voice. And Tessa did that over the Olympics. I'll certainly give her that. And that's what I'd like to see her declare.
We'll talk some more about London being the greatest city a little bit later on. Today, the deadline expires for governments across the world to take action to reduce fees for money transfers to a minimum of 5%. But it's a deadline the British government looks set to miss, and the impact will be felt by hundreds of thousands of Londoners. Jerry Thomas has our report.
The UK is estimated to transfer £15 billion in remittances every year, with 65% going to developing countries. It is thought up to £5 billion comes from London, much of it going to friends and family. It's more than any other region in the UK, in large part due to the high numbers of foreign-born workers in the capital. But there is increasing concern that Londoners may be being overcharged. This is particularly the case for transfers to sub-Saharan Africa, where the average fee is 12% and can be as high as 20% in some cases. This means that if a worker in London wants to transfer £100, they could be charged up to £120 for doing so. But charges like this were meant to become a thing of the past. 5 years ago, the leaders of the world's largest 8 economies agreed to introduce a cap of 5% on money transfers. The deadline was today, but in London at least, the high charges are set to continue.
Well, joining me now is Dominic Thorncroft. Dominic's from the Association of UK Payment Institutions, who represent the industry apart from the big players, Western Union and MoneyGram. Dominic Thorncroft, why are the fees so high to send money to countries, particularly to countries in sub-Saharan Africa?
Well, I think it's a particular Africa issue, to be fair. Certainly on other corridors, say the corridor to Pakistan, for example, the fees are less than 1%.
So why in sub-Saharan Africa?
Because there's no competition. The competition is not as much as on other corridors, and because there's not so much competition, the prices.
So the companies who are offering it are just trying to make as big a profit as they can.
Well, I don't want to comment on what the companies that are operating on that corridor are doing specifically. They're not our members, as you've mentioned.
It looks uncomfortable, though, doesn't it? It looks like robbing the poor to pay the rich.
Well, the problem is it's quite a complicated situation, and it has arisen because a range of stakeholders, by which I mean governments, policymakers, banks, and law enforcement, among others, have not really addressed the issue about why there's not proper competition on the corridor.
OK, the cap proposed 5 years ago, and we'll bring Tessa Jowell in on this in a moment. It was at the GA. It seems to have achieved almost nothing. Why?
Well, I think, to be honest, I think it's symptomatic of governments wanting to just put a marker in the sand, but not being willing to put the spade work in.
Well, we'll put that to the politicians in a minute. The World Bank claims the cap would save poorer countries £10 billion a year. That's got to be worth pursuing, hasn't it?
It certainly would be worth pursuing, but the only way we're going to achieve it realistically is by getting more competition into the market.
OK, just a very quick thought about Londoners sending £5 billion a year to other countries. Do you regret in any way that the money isn't spent where it's earned, here in London?
Well, let's be clear, the people who are sending this money are poorer workers doing maybe 3 or 4 jobs and obviously wanting to help their families and their countries of origin, particularly in Africa. They're settled, they've been here a long time.
OK, we'll hear Tessa Jowell's take on this next, but she's already issued a statement that I've read calling it cruel exploitation. She says your industry is ripping people off. Are you?
No, I don't think the industry collectively is ripping firms off. The firms that we represent are offering a choice to consumers, and we would like our firms to have more opportunity to operate on corridors, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. And I don't accept that we're ripping. There's a rip-off.
All right, let's bring Tessa Jowell in. You're the one who used those words. It's a rip-off. What makes you say that?
Well, because of the excessive charges, and Dominic is right to say that by and large, people sending money home are in very low-paid jobs. They work very hard to earn that money to send to their families in some of the poorest countries in the world. And I've launched a campaign today, and it's very specific, and it calls on the largest money transfer tax companies to halve the commission between now and Christmas in order to provide some relief, not just to those sending money, but the families receiving it.
Which is a short-term measure. But what about the bigger term? 5 years ago, the G8 countries signed up to this, and almost nothing has happened. So how do you propose to make it stick now? What happens now? Not just for Christmas, but beyond?
Well, there has to be concerted political will. There has to be concerted will in relation to negotiation with the banks. And this is still an unfulfilled, incomplete commitment by the G8 and by the G20. I've applied for an adjournment debate in the House of Commons. That's one way of giving voice on behalf of millions of people.
Sorry to interrupt you, Tessa Jowell. Let me bring Matthew in. Does anyone ever raise this in your constituency? Does anyone ever say to you, I'm being horribly ripped off with sending money home?
They don't, but I'm sure there are many people who are sending money home, so it is a great cause of concern for me as a constituency MP. This is something that I can actually support as well, but I would like to see some of the African governments actually playing their part to ensure that the charges from their end are reduced. And I think if you look at countries like Rwanda recently, who have had aid money taken away because some of their activities, they've asked people to send money home through the Conciliation Fund, and that means that money is going back, but the remittances are going back as a whole rather than banks or some of the clearing agencies taking more money.
Another quick thought from Tessa Jowell. Some might say you've cannily chosen to champion an issue that will win you support among black, Asian and minority ethnic Londoners, which of course would play well in any mayoral election campaign?
Well, you can see everything through that prism, but I represent a constituency where, in part, in some of the wards I represent, 90% of people are black. This is a big issue for them, and so I'm serving my constituents, and in doing that, also serving a lot of Londoners who are working hard in our city, making our city work, but they're being ripped off in supporting their families.
We'll carry
in
on
other
with the cost of living in London. Dominic, thank you very much for joining us. Now, the capital is often said to be in an elite group of international cities, New York, Tokyo, Shanghai and so on. But according to some, not least the mayor himself, London is in a class apart. Put simply, the greatest city on earth. But is it? And for whom? Andrew Cryan has this.
Hi folks, I'm Boris Johnson. I'm the Mayor of London, and this is my office where I get on with helping to lead the greatest city on earth. The greatest city in the world. The greatest city on earth. The greatest city on earth!
It might well be Boris Johnson's most repeated phrase. And this week, whilst visiting the Ford factory in Dagenham, he was happy to tell us why.
Well, it's the world's leading financial capital, it's the artistic capital, it's the cultural capital, it's the capital of science and innovation. I also think that in the last few years you've seen fantastic improvements in the quality of life in London, crime down an awful long way, and the best single indicator is that it's where people want to be.
But if, as the mayor suggests, it's people wanting to be here that's the key factor, there might be a bit of a problem. Almost exactly the same number of people are leaving London as coming to live here, with 342,000 people abandoning the city in the last year we have data for, and just 366,000 coming to live here. Perhaps then a mixed message rather than a ringing endorsement. And it might be about to get worse. According to one recent survey, 43% of young Londoners expect to abandon the city in the next decade. The woman behind that polling says there's only one demographic who really enjoy the capital, and that's people like Boris Johnson.
There are some people who feel London is absolutely wonderful in every way, and that typically is the well-off baby boomer who lucked out, frankly. London delivered to them, as one guy in a focus group said, I live in a great pile of money. You know, they bought properties a long time ago, those properties have accumulated, and life is sweet. But for others, it's very difficult.
So, back in Barking and Dagenham, where we spoke to the mayor, do people agree with his assertion that London is the greatest city on earth?
This man's aristocracy, it is for him. If you look at the opportunity for someone like him, it is. London is the capital city. If you're rich and you can live off the work of other people's work, come to London.
Too many people.
Yeah.
Too many. Different countries. Some people, they like to work. Some people, they don't like, just to rob.
It's a dump. All the floods and the sewage.
At the countries I've visited, London's the best.
But there are no shortage of surveys, magazines and polls which all seem to back up the mayor's view. Now, in just the last year, London has won a whole host of accolades. So, for example, Forbes magazine said it was the world's most influential city. According to PricewaterhouseCoopers, it's the global city of opportunity, and the Boston Consulting Group said it's the best place in the world to work. The only snag is for London, of course, that other similar surveys say something else altogether. So, for example, a new survey of global business leaders this week suggested the capital was losing ground as a financial centre.
It's falling behind, that was the feeling. And the feeling was that New York is gaining pace, and they thought also that in 5 years' time London would fall even further behind, which is a bit alarming. China is getting in on the act. It's more than a two-city race. It's probably a five-city race, to be fair.
But at the end of the day, what constitutes greatness is probably a matter of personal opinion. And the fact that at least some people are willing to make the case for London's greatness is a sign that the capital is doing well. At least for some.
Most cosmopolitan, multiracial, generous-hearted city on earth. The greatest city on earth. The greatest city on earth.
Joining us is David Goodhart, the chair of the think tank Demos, who recently wrote an article for Demos Quarterly entitled London, All That Glitters. So, David, what is the greatest city on earth, if not the one we're sitting in right now? Give me a benchmark.
Well, it depends what we're talking about. If we're talking about quality of life, then London, I would have thought, comes quite a long way down the list, particularly if you're not talking about affluent people. If you're an average Londoner, you are living in a city where Life satisfaction is the lowest in Britain, anxiety levels are the highest, crime may be coming down but it's still the highest levels in the country, pollution is the highest in the country. It is the apotheosis of a transactional capitalist city. Now if you go to places in continental Europe, the quality of life will be far higher in Amsterdam or in Copenhagen or in Stockholm or in Berlin. These are cities that actually manage to combine what people want, which is relative stability and security in their lives, with reasonably high incomes.
Though, are they? I mean, this is an enormous city, and you must accept that as London's ambassador to the world, Boris Johnson's job is to sell the capital, and that means, as we saw, using his catchphrase
Absolutely,
a lot.
but we don't have to believe him. I mean, we can acknowledge inside the country that it's a fib. If you're somebody on an average income, you have a far higher quality of life outside London than you do inside the city.
So what do you think the best measure of the greatness of a city is? Is it happiness?
Well, it's, the degree of contentment and well-being of the average citizen in the city. And on that score, London does pretty badly. I mean, it has huge levels of churn.
Is there any point in the past that London has got it right? When did it? When was the last time London really was a great city for as many people as possible?
I mean, it went through a long period of decline after the war. I mean, you probably have to go back to the sort of interwar period when it was growing very fast. But I think there was a greater sense of stability. There was perhaps a greater familiarity in neighbourhoods and so on. There wasn't that degree of churn.
OK, so some people would now say David is just being a bit British, talking down something that's actually quite good.
Well, there's nothing wrong with being a bit British.
OK, you pretty much admitted it then.
I'm just trying to cut through the guff that we hear constantly from Boris about this, and not just from Boris. We hear it every day. You open the Evening Standard and you see the same sort of London boosterism.
Well, let's see if the others want to cut through some of the guff as well. Tessa Jow, we think you're standing to be the Labour candidate for London's mayor.
You really want to go on about this, don't you?
What would your catchphrase be?
I think London is a great city. I think that, I want to do justice. There's some really sort of important points, I think, that have been made. I think it's a great city.
But not the greatest city?
Well, it's my city. It's where I've lived all my adult life. I am a Londoner. So, yes, as far as I'm concerned, it's the greatest city. But by any measure, I'm one of the lucky people. I've got enough money to enjoy London and get around and all the rest of it. But, I would advise everybody to have a look and listen to what Deborah Mattinson learnt in this study.
So you
about
tell
London.
me, what needs fixing?
Well, I'll tell you exactly what needs fixing. We need more homes for Londoners. We need those, we have one of the highest rate of unemployment among young people. You can't rest easy. You can't rest easy while nearly 25% of 18 to 24-year-olds are out of work. So London also does not have infrastructure that can prepare it for being a city of 20 million by 2030.
OK, we might be able to get onto that.
It's fragile.
OK, let bring Matthew back in. What do you say to your constituents who are really struggling? Because I'm sure you think it's a great city as well. It's just not a great city for everyone.
I have to say, I tend to agree with Tessa and David as well. While it is a great city, it's not comparable to anywhere else because it's unique, it's London. But we do have some unique problems here as well. Transport, as mentioned, housing, and also education as well. The shortage of school spaces and places in my constituency is dire. We're really struggling. So a lot of people coming into the capital city.
If there are these problems, does it help or hinder your average Londoner, Boris Johnson, travelling the world, making these high-fluting claims?
Well, I'd be very upset if the mayor was going abroad and saying London isn't very good. That would.
Is it really about London, or is it about Boris Johnson, Tessa Jow?
No, I think it is about London. And if you're Mayor of London, you've got to be a great ambassador for London, because one of the things he's got to do is to encourage other countries to invest in our city. That's a very important part of how our city becomes
David,
wealthier.
do you think he's doing a good job?
But the important thing is that wealth and that investment is shared. And the great risk facing London is that it becomes too city.
So let's just have a quick thought on it.
Well, I mean, I think if you take something like housing that Tessa mentioned, I mean, we need in London, 40 to 50,000 houses a year. Last year we had 18,000 completions. I mean, it ought to be possible for a mayor to focus on things like that rather than travel the world telling fibs about how wonderful it is to live here. London is the most politically, economically and ethnically polarised part of the United Kingdom. There's no question about that. Two-thirds of minority Londoners voted Labour in the last European elections.
Which might well bode well for...
Two-thirds of white British voters voted for the Tories or UKIP. And UKIP got 17% in London. The idea that UKIP has no vote in London is not true at all. Okay. It's also hugely economically divided. Okay. I mean, we have some of the poorest parts of Britain and the richest, obviously.
We could talk about London. We could all talk about London all day, but I'm really sorry, you must leave it there. It's lovely to have you on the programme. Thank you very much indeed. Now, for the rest of the news in 60 seconds.
Ambulance crews at Northwick Park Hospital will now have to contact their central control room before taking any patients to their under-pressure hospital's A&E department. The hospital has been struggling to cope since nearby units at Central Middlesex and Hammersmith closed in September. More than 350 guns have been handed into police stations in London as part of the Met Police's first firearms amnesty in 6 years. More than 12,000 rounds of ammunition were also handed in. 12 million commuter journeys could be disrupted when one of London's busiest transport hubs, London Bridge, partly closes over Christmas and New Year, rail authorities have warned. The disruption will result from work to open 2 new platforms. The London Ambulance Service is facing a winter crisis due to a soaring number of 999 calls and staff shortages, Boris Johnson has warned Health Secretary Jeremy Hunt. The Mayor wants extra help for the service, with currently 1 in 7 staff leaving every year.
So that's the week that's just gone. Let's look ahead. Next week, the autumn statement. Sir Peter Hendy, Commissioner of Transport for London, has already sent his Christmas present list to the Chancellor in the form of asking for £20 million to help with the funding, the planning for Crossrail 2. I wonder if our guests consider that to be money well spent. We'll leave the mayoralty alone now, Tessa Jowell. As a constituency MP in London, what would you ask for? What would be on your Christmas list?
What I would love agreement to for my constituents are 2 things. First of all, a new health centre on the site of the old Dulwich Hospital, and also a secondary school alongside it for the many local children who simply can't get into the available schools.
So they're having to travel too far at the moment?
Exactly.
OK, let's ask Matthew, for your constituents, what's on your Christmas wish list?
Very similar to Tessa, that I would be seeking step-free access at Mill Hill Broadway on the Thameslink line, something I've been campaigning on for a number of years, and also a free school, the Marco Polo Academy, that local residents have been campaigning for. So school places and transport once again.
Would either of you admit to what you would cut? We've got to balance the books after all.
I want to see the living wage across London. The amount that's currently spent in tax credits from the welfare budget is effectively a subsidy for low wages. It has to be done over time, but I hope that next year, 2015, we can see a very large increase in the number of London businesses paying the living wage.
Thank you very much indeed. My thanks to Tessa Jowell and to Matthew Offord. With that, it's back to Andrew.